Our presenter tonight, Deb Griffith, is a parent of 3 boys in the Centennial School District, frustrated with the loss of education opportunity for her children. She spent time researching why our schools continue to struggle financially. She soon became a parent advocate and chair of the Centennial Legislation Action Committee, a community group that advocates at the state capitol on education issues. She is currently the Director of Communications and Community Outreach for the Schools for Equity in Education. She has a passion for assisting parents and community members to advocate for their children and their schools. It's my privilege tonight to introduce to you Deb Griffith, who I've had the privilege of working with as the C representative from the Paynesville School District for several years. Deb Griffith.
Thank you. I'm always glad to come out to the community, so thanks for having me out here tonight, and I will just go ahead and get started. First, I want to say just a little bit about Schools for Equity in Education. C is an organization of 58 Minnesota school districts, which represents, those districts serve 250,000 Minnesota school children, which is about a third of the K-12 population in Minnesota. There's a couple of characteristics that tend to bring our schools together into C. The first one is that our school demographic usually results in getting a minimum state aid because we don't have a lot of categorical or kids that need extra funding to be successful, so we tend to get the minimum of state aid, and I'll explain it a little bit more in a little bit. And the other characteristic that brings our schools together is that we tend to be poverty poor districts. This does not mean that everybody in our district is poor. What it means is when we add up our industrial, our commercial, and our residential real estate, we tend to fall well below the state average, which makes it then difficult to get referendum revenue to make up for inadequate state funding, because the burden goes to pay for referendum revenue falls more directly on the taxpayer's shoulders. This is what Schools for Equity works for, and I find it a little surprising because when I first read this, I thought, well, obviously Minnesota being the education state, this is what we already do, but unfortunately this is still utopia. But what C strives for is an equal access to a quality education for all Minnesota kids, regardless of where they live. We also want legislation that ensures the equitable distribution of school resources. This doesn't mean that everybody gets the same thing, but what it means is all our school districts get what they need so that our kids can get the education they deserve. We want to see a property tax system that is fair and provides equal access to referendum revenue, regardless of the property wealth of that district. And this is a novel concept because we always hear about accountability at the state level, but we would like to see accountability for our elected officials, that they are accountable for adequate and equitable education funding and policy that enables our students to meet state and federal academic standards. And finally, we would really like to see an educated and engaged community of parents. Grandparents, business leaders, everybody who understands the value of a K-12 education and what it really will do for the future prosperity in Minnesota. And that's kind of my path to being here before you tonight. I have never been a school administrator, I've not been a teacher. My background, as Deb said, is I'm a parent of 3 boys in Centennial School District. And when they were old enough, I sent them off to school and I said to Centennial, you know what, I'll keep parenting them, but we need you to give them the very best education that they need and deserve. And because I like to be involved in things, I went ahead and I signed up for that PTA president, and I volunteered to do the fall fundraiser because we found out real soon that I could raise a whole lot of money selling candles, wrapping paper, and candy at the elementary level. And then the PTA wanted to do something else, so I volunteered to do the bingo night, and it's a fun family night and you could raise money. And I soon found out that I was obviously very money motivated, but I also found out that no matter how hard I worked at that level, I couldn't stop the cuts that were happening year after year because we could not pass referendum in our school district. So then I dabbled my feet in that referendum campaign, and it is really a ridiculous way to fund education. We pit our senior citizens against our school children. We pit Save Our School folks against the No New Tax folks. We pit the generation of people who said the education I got was good enough for me against our children who are looking at competing in a 21st century global economy that the generations before had no idea what jobs would be available for them. So what happened is when I was working on that referendum campaign, Our levy group had identified about 600 email addresses of education supporters, and obviously I would be on that list. So all of a sudden, this group decided to send out an email and say, you know what? We're going to start up a legislative action committee. Yes, Centennial is going to have a legislative action committee. And they invited everybody to this informational meeting. And when that email came across my computer, it really made me stop in my tracks. Because what it occurred to me was maybe that fundraising at the elementary level and the referendum campaign, maybe we were working on the symptom. And maybe it was time for some of us to work on the problem. So I decided to go to that informational meeting, and I don't know how many of you have ever had this volunteering experience, but I went to that meeting promising my husband I was just going to see what it was about. And by the end of that evening, I was the new chair of Centennial's brand new Legislative Action Committee. Yeah, some of you have been there before. But anyways, we knew nothing. I actually grew up in St. Paul. I never stepped foot in the state capitol. I had no idea how laws were made. I really didn't even know who my state legislators were. I could tell you who the president was, but once you get past that, I really wasn't too politically involved. But we threw ourselves in there because we were really getting frustrated with a lot of opportunity. And that is what my experience is to stand here before you, because as I was trying to find out all the information so I could have intelligent conversations with the legislators, I networked with groups, and C was one of them because they truly understood what was going on in our school district. And now I do this kind of work for 58 districts instead of just Centennial. So the first thing we have to establish is it appropriate to expect the state of Minnesota to fund our schools? And the answer to that is absolutely. Because the state constitution, which by the way is the job description for the governor and the legislators, it only calls out two specific areas of government that the state must fund. The first one is trunk highway systems, and the other one is found in Article 13, Section 1. And it talks about our schools. And I really think our forefathers did understand what would make Minnesota prosperous. We are not a tourist destination, even if you love the snow. We don't have a lot of raw materials, but what we had and what we have built in Minnesota was a knowledge capital. We have very productive workers. So when the Constitution spells this out specifically, it says the stability of a Republican form of government depends mainly upon the intelligence of its people. And then it goes on to say, it is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. Now, duty, I think, is a pretty strong word. It's not a word that says, well, you know, at the end of the session, if you have any money left, maybe you'll think about funding schools. And it's not a word that suggests, you know, do your pet project first and then maybe you can think about schools. Duty is a very strong, active word that our legislators are bound to. And then the Constitution goes on and says the legislature shall make provisions by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools. So when we expect the state to fund our schools, it's not something that would be nice that they would do. It's something that they're constitutionally obligated to do. So we're now going to walk a little bit into education funding. And when you talk about this at the legislature around, you tend to hear this thing that education funding is so complex that there's probably only 3 people in the entire state of Minnesota that understand it in its entirety. And those people are Tom Melcher down at the Minnesota Department of Ed, who's the finance director, and maybe a couple fiscal analysts at the Capitol. And that's true, but I think we really can get the basics of it. I almost feel when people are saying that to us, they're kind of patting us on the head and asking us to go home. But we really can understand, and we need to understand how our schools are funded. So this comes out of the 115-page book that the legislature has developed for new legislators, and it talks about how our schools are funded. So there's this general education aid, and that is the largest share of the state funding, and it is intended to provide the basic financial support for our schools. And within that are 2 pieces. The first one is the basic formula. Now this is a per pupil funding that every child generates when they walk through the door. But along the way, the legislature has understood that there are categories of children and categories of districts where they need more funding to be successful. And so they set up categories, and for every student or district that falls in these categories, extra money is generated. And I've listed in here, for example, compensatory. Compensatory is a word for children who live in poverty. It is well researched and documented that children that live in poverty do not do as well as their peers unless there's intervention. So so for every child that qualifies as living in poverty, there's extra funding generated for that child. Then there's limited English proficiency. I mean, you don't even really need the research that exists. It's pretty intuitive that if a child struggles with the English language, they're probably really going to struggle passing the grad test that they must pass to get their diploma. So we need to put more resources into those children to make them successful. There's extended time, again, that's for children who struggle. We know the research is very strong that if children need more schooling and they need more year-round schooling opportunities. In fact, a recent report came out and said that about 80 to 85% of the achievement gap is directly attributable to the long summer break that our kids get. They forget so much and they get further and further behind. There's a couple sparsity categories. That's for kids who live in geographic isolation. It's where you can't have the efficiencies of really large high schools because you can't find 100 kids within a reasonable bus route. And then, of course, the cost of transportation is high. So again, those are the type of categories that have been set up by the legislature. And I think another point that I think adds to the confusion is something that I do try to be careful of, as to point out that outside of the general education funding is more categorical aid. And what we have to do is be careful, because I think it was 2003, 2004, when we were facing tough economic times in Minnesota. They said that they were holding education harmless. But what they did is they slipped in one extra word. They said we're holding general education harmless. And they went ahead and made cuts to the other categorical aid. Well, within that categorical aid is special education, early childhood, and community services. And they actually cut special education that year, which, as you know, it is mandated services. Our schools have no option on whether they're going to provide those services. And yet, if that's cut, and then we have to shift some dollars over from general education, can you really claim that education was held harmless? So I like to keep an eye, just a good ear on all the rhetoric that we hear sometimes. The thing about what has happened over the years is it is expensive to fund the basic formula piece, because that goes to every kid in every district in the state. So along the way, when there's not that kind of money, if people don't want to put that kind of money into education, they tend to lean heavily on the categorical aid to kind of generate money maybe for their district. And so the legislature has been neglecting that basic formula for categorical aid, trying to get money to their own districts. So the basic formula piece, this is really the meat and potatoes for our school districts, like Paynesville and like Centennial, where I'm from. This is the basic district operating funds. It's the dollar amount that is given to our schools to provide what we would consider the quality education that our kids need. This is the funding that our districts use to determine how many teachers they can afford to maintain what class sizes. This is the funding that our schools use to determine what programs our kids are going to be offered. Are they going to have music and art in elementaries? Are they going to have foreign languages? When will they begin? Are they going to have some advanced placement opportunity? How about some early intervention programs for our struggling children? What about extracurriculars? What ones are we going to offer, and how much are we going to make our family pay? And also, bus routes. Are we going to make our kids walk 1 mile or 2 miles to school? All of this kind of thing that when we think about schools is supposed to be paid out of this basic formula. Well, how is that calculated? The legislature sets the per pupil formula amount. Currently, it's $5,124. And then you multiply it by nothing as simple as how many students are in your district.